Welcome to our latest episode of Called to the Bar, International Law Over Drinks, a series of casual conversations about current issues in international law, life in academia, and whatever else is on our mind. In these conversations, we are speaking off the cuff and without benefit of footnotes, and nothing we say should be taken to have been thoroughly peer reviewed. I'm Imogen Saunders, Associate Professor and Director of the Centre for International and Public Law at the Australian National University College of Law. This morning, or this evening for them, I'm joined by two of my fabulous colleagues from the United States of America. Professor Peter Danchin is Jacob A. France Professor of International Law at University of Maryland, Carey School of Law, and Professor Shruti Rana is Professor of Law, University of Missouri School of Law, and Assistant Provost for Strategic Faculty Initiatives, University of Missouri. So Shruti, Peter, good evening. My first question for you is, as we are an international law podcast over drinks, what's your drink tonight?
Well, so I have a refreshing Gatorade. I wish I had something more exciting or sophisticated, but after this, I have to put my 7-year-old to bed. And it's also very hot and humid right now in Missouri. So I was thinking electrolytes, something cold and refreshing.
Imogen, wonderful to join you, and Shruti as well. Like Shruti, I'm actually drinking something relatively mild, a very strong Italian roast coffee. I've been teaching all afternoon, and I needed something strong to keep me going. But a nice South African pinotage awaits me after this podcast.
Very nice. Well, it's become customary on this podcast that when we introduce new guests, that we talk a bit about how we met and became, in our case, collaborators and friends. Now, for the three of us, it was a project that started with a grant application in 2018 called Navigating the Backlash Against International Law and Institutions. This was a smallish Australian National University grant for seed funding that allowed both of you to visit Canberra in June 2019 for a workshop here. And then for myself and one of our other project team members, Professor Jeremy Farrell, to visit the US for workshops in Indiana, which is where you were at the time, Shruti, and Baltimore, which is where you are, Peter. It's always unknown and perhaps potentially a little precarious, bringing unknown people together to collaborate. But luckily, we, Jeremy, and our other team member, Professor Jolyon Ford, all got on really well. We had a few nights of enjoying good wine and food in Canberra in the US, and great international law discussions, of course. We've since co-authored articles, and we were lucky enough to get further funding to look at the related issue of populism and international law, which we'll be doing together until 2027. So that's how I'll tell the story, but does anything leap out for you about how we all met or built our working relationship?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, actually, because this project, as you say, Imogen, has been just extraordinarily productive. And, the five of us, I think, have worked very, very closely together. I live in Baltimore in the United States, but my family lives in Melbourne in Australia. And I think the origins may date back to a particular breakfast that I had with Professor Farrell, who you mentioned, Jeremy Farrell. And we were both discussing the news of the day over a good Melbourne brekkie and trying to puzzle through a little bit about what was happening in international politics, particularly this idea of backlash to global law and institutions. And suddenly, if I recall correctly, Jeremy pulled out a table napkin and started sketching some ideas furiously on the back of a napkin and suggested that we try to actually put together some kind of proposal to think together, try to think together and get a team together to work on these really interesting issues. And so, like all great projects, it started from a very small beginning. And I think we really couldn't have imagined what is it now, 5 years later, what this project has actually yielded. But, in terms of the other partnerships in the project, of course, Joe Ford, I later came to realize, a fellow South African. I'm originally from South Africa, and one of our conferences last year was the University of Cape Town. So there are lots of connections there, I realized unknowingly, between myself and Professor Joe Ford. And of course, for many years, I'd known about the Center for International Public Law at ANU, and in fact had visited there briefly. You may not know this, Imogen, many years ago when Kim Rubenstein was directing the center. I'd spent it was a month actually at ANU. So I was absolutely delighted when I met you and discovered that you were leading the center today and would be part of the project. And of course, Shruti and I had been colleagues for many, many years at the University of Maryland at the law school. In fact, our offices were next door to each other. So we were partners in crime, I think, from the very beginning. And we didn't actually know it, but we'd both actually been at Columbia Law School for many years. We didn't know each other at that time, but we're both doing international comparative work at the time in New York. And so it was wonderful to reconnect with Shruti. And at that time, she was at Indiana University, and we contacted her to bring her into the partnership as well. And so I think that's how it all began. And here we are all these years later.
Yeah, and I would echo a lot of that. And I guess first I should make my standard disclaimer that I'm appearing here in my personal capacity and nothing I say should be attributed to the university and speaking on our own behalf. And I think this has just been a really exciting partnership. And likewise, I remember Peter telling me about that conversation and the notes on the napkin. And I think we had happened to run into each other at a conference and had a great dinner where we were just talking about the state of the world and all the things that were happening. And then we started talking about this project, which, as Peter said, I thought would be a great chance to reconnect. I view Peter as one of my oldest, or I guess you should say long-standing academic friends, because we're all quite young. I'll make that point also. I started my academic career in the office next door, and we just had all these great conversations about our work and the state of international law and global governance. And so that was an exciting chance to work together. And it's been, we've had so many unexpected twists and turns, right? I think when we started this in 2017, 2018, we could have never imagined what would happen in 2020. And in fact, as Imogen mentioned, you all had a chance to come to Indiana. We went to Maryland, and then we had a workshop in Australia in 2019. And that was my very first trip to Australia. I had a chance to go to New Zealand also. So it was my first trip to that part of the world, and incredibly exciting. And I also brought my 2-year-old along and my mom to help take care of her while we were doing the workshop. And I think that was my last international trip before the pandemic. And as I said, in 2019, I don't think we could have guessed what would happen next. But because we'd had a chance to all meet in person and attend these workshops together, we'd built this really great working relationship. And I think we were able to take advantage of one of the few silver linings of the pandemic, I think, was how the world was flattened in a sense, right? That we were all going onto Zoom and online anyway. And it just made it easy to continue our work and research and partnership via Zoom. And so I think I felt almost equally as connected to all of you as some of the colleagues I had, like literally, next door to me in Indiana. And it was also quite poignant, I think, to see the contrast between how our regions of the world were responding to the pandemic. Because I remember at I think maybe it was 2021 or possibly early 2022, there was another workshop at ANU, and you were all able to meet in person and be in the room together and sit there and talk to each other. And in the United States, we were still on Zoom. We were not really interacting in person because, the rates of COVID were quite high. And I think at that point in Australia, they were extremely low. And so it was just so, I just remember sitting there thinking, our countries could have gone in different directions and we could be meeting in person again, right? And at least you all were able to meet in person, and we got to watch, from the TV screens, but still we had the chance to participate and continue to interact. And then, of course, I feel like the pandemic was bookended by another trip to Australia, right? We had a chance to do another workshop, and that was a really exciting experience. And so I think that, we had this exciting partnership. We were able to continue it. And the ways we were able to continue this partnership, I think, means that we were really able to continue our work despite the world events happening, but also that in turn, those world events really shaped our work. And how we were thinking and how we were thinking about borders even, right? And Australia being, essentially surrounded by water, and the United States being in a different position. And I'm really grateful that we've had the chance to build these ties and do all of this work together.
Yeah, I think, looking back on it, we wrote an article, the three of us and Jeremy Farrell together during 2020. And we wrote it on Zoom, essentially. And you're right, Shruti, during that time, it was probably the closest contact I had with colleagues was the four of us working on that article. And it was also probably one of my favorite things that I've ever written. That process of collaborating so closely. Everyone was at home. We didn't have anywhere to go. We didn't have anywhere to go. We didn't have any other meetings to go to, or if we did, they were all virtual anyway. And so it was very much, I think, a product of that particular time, and feeling paradoxically, and our article talks about paradoxes, but feeling paradoxically closer, even as we were so geographically distant. So, you both talked about being at Columbia together, and now you're obviously in very different places in the States. But one of the things we do talk about in this podcast is the many and varied ways to have a career in international law academia. There's not necessarily one true or right way to do it. And we know that there are a lot of students and early career academics listening to this podcast who appreciate hearing different ways that people have built their international law careers. Now, you both have fantastic careers in international law, fantastic careers in academia. And from the introduction, we know you both have the big fancy titles that match those wonderful careers. Could you talk briefly about the path you took to get where you are now?
Sure. Well, I can start. So I trace my interest in international law to my experiences growing up, where my family moved around a lot and also traveled a lot to different countries, but also within the United States. And I was always struck by the differences in development and the perspectives and the experiences I was seeing in all of these different places, and thinking about things like the legacies of colonialism, and also noting that a lot of the debates and discussions I saw in other parts of the world, I didn't see happening in the academic environment as much in the United States. And by academic environment at that stage, I mean like elementary school, junior high. So I went to college with this idea that I wanted to do something international, and I didn't know what. And I happened to go to the University of California at a really contentious time in the state's history, when there were a lot of reactions to increasing numbers of immigrants. The economy was really opening up at that time and becoming what it is today, one of the world's leading economies. And I had this idea from watching everything around me that it was the lawyers who could get everything done, and who were doing the most exciting things. And so I thought, I decided to go to law school. I went to the London School of Economics first, which was a fascinating experience. And in hindsight, I got to be there during a really key moment for the gender and international relations movement, where people were really questioning the traditional foundations of IR. And to me, I didn't realize that it was such a momentous point in time. I just thought, wow, my professors are talking about these really interesting ideas, and I want to learn more about them and keep doing this work. But first I want to go to law school and see, what I can do. And so that's how I ended up at Columbia. I thought it was a perfect combination of international perspectives, being in, the world, one of the world's most international cities, and then going to law school. And when I graduated, I still had this idea I wanted to do international law. But what I didn't know was how difficult it was to do international law as a career in the United States at that point, because I went to all these interviews and I would talk about how much I wanted to do international law. And I worked for a couple of law firms in San Francisco and DC, where I had great experiences, but where international law mostly meant I got to work with clients from different countries, or maybe a company that was embroiled in a US lawsuit. But to me, that was still American law, maybe with different clients and some different people involved, but it was still US law, not international law. So I kept trying to get into those fields, and I did a little bit of international arbitration and things like that. And I ended up eventually getting a job at the United Nations, working for the UN CEDAW committee. And I should say that all this time I was doing more traditional law firm work. I had taken different opportunities to work with NGOs, mostly women's rights NGOs working on women's human rights issues, which led me to the UN to continue that work. And I now, if I look back at, again, what I was experiencing when I graduated from law school, it was really difficult to get a job in the United States focusing on international law, outside of a couple of big organizations like Human Rights Watch. But about 10 years later, then when I went to the UN and into academia, it was a different situation. And looking back, I can see that was we talk about the proliferation of human rights institutions and organizations and that whole network that arose in the 1990s. By the 2000s, there were organizations that were growing and had actual jobs available that paid and where they would hire people. And so I got to join into that once I had a little bit of experience. And I loved the position at the UN, and especially working on, having this incredible chance to work on women's human rights, but also with these incredible women who make up the CEDAW committee from all over the world, who've had these amazing careers as advocates, as activists, as judges, and then are trying to shape human rights with that experience. And somewhere in that process, I decided I wanted to try and be an academic. And again, it was because I had this idea that the best way to do international law and pursue the things I was interested in, but also get paid at the same time and have a job, or what I thought was a real job, as in not temporary and not a couple of months long or something like that, was to go into academia. And so that was what I did. I started turning some of the ideas I had into papers, and just went on the market and ended up at the University of Maryland with Peter. And so, was lucky enough to really have the chance to, again, be a part of really growing areas of international law. And I think academia gives you the opportunity to be involved with cutting edge issues and to approach things from your perspectives, and have a chance to engage with people from different disciplines, different countries, all of that. And so in my academic career, I've been to a number of different schools, but I've really, my entire career in the academic setting has been at US public flagship universities, which to me means something really special, right? It's the public flagship land grant universities that have a particular mission in the United States that's to serve the state and their people. And these are the institutions that have been the engines of transformation for the states themselves, but also people, right? Because they're meant to be low cost or more affordable. They're meant to provide opportunities for anyone in the state, and also people outside the state. And they're meant to create the research and innovation that drives growth and opportunity in the state. So to me, it's really meaningful to be a part of that process and to think about how the university can best achieve that promise, especially with so many different stakeholders and world and national events going on. And so somewhere along the line, I thought I started really getting interested in an administrative leadership career, which to most people sounds really boring, or they think, who wants to be an administrator and have to deal with like budgets and all those kinds of things. But I actually find it to be tremendously interesting and fulfilling, because when you're at the academic leadership level, every decision you make and every conversation you have in some way contributes to the impact of the university and the future of the university and the experience of the students and faculty there. And so I feel like we have this, you're thinking about the mission of the university on a daily basis. And so even if you're thinking about budgets or something, you're thinking about, well, how do we maximize the investments and we can make in people and like what we can do. And at the same time, I think the work is really interesting because it's so different every day. So I never know whether I show up at work and this is the day that I get to be a diplomat, or is this the day I get to be a lawyer or a manager or a professor or just a citizen of the state, trying to influence the direction of the state. So to me, that variety is really interesting, and the chance to do all those different roles. And I really think at the end of the day, some of the research and writing that we do in international law does shape some of it, right? I can see how other people are handling governance challenges and thinking about different stakeholders and things, and hopefully trying to apply the positive lessons here at home.
And I imagine that when you started your career, you never necessarily saw yourself ending up where you are now, Shruti. But one of the things that Doug actually said in an earlier podcast was that a piece of career advice he'd been told was your career never really makes sense going forward, but it's looking back, you can see how everything you did led you to the position you are at now. And, the things that you did with gender early on still find reflection in your writing, which we'll talk about later.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. It's only looking backwards that you can see the threads and a pathway that sort of makes sense. And so I always want to emphasize that to students. You have no idea where your career could take you, and that's a really good thing. And I don't think, I'm in the provost's office now, I don't think I knew what a provost was when I was at the university or what they did. And it's actually quite interesting. And it's good actually when no one knows what you do, because that means you're doing a good job and keeping out of the limelight and all of that. But likewise, I ended up in fields where there were very little job opportunities when I graduated, but now there's so many. And so those opportunities wouldn't have been there when I graduated. And it's just, some of it is seeing where life takes you.
Absolutely. And Peter, you are, as I said, the Jacob A. France Chair of International Law at Maryland. How did you end up in this position?
Yeah, it's such a wonderful question, and I so enjoyed listening to Shruti. Actually, some of those things I didn't know, but I definitely agree that things make much more sense in retrospect. You can sort of see a logical thread, and at the time, you of course never know what you're doing half the time. But when I think back in the paths I've taken, and it hasn't been a linear path by any stretch. Part of it, like Shruti, is actually biography. I guess they say biography is destiny, but I grew up in South Africa. Originally, I'm South African, hence the somewhat strange hybrid accent. And my family emigrated to Australia when I was 12 for lots of different reasons, partly, of course, to do with the politics at that time and the apartheid state in South Africa. And I was very fortunate to come to Melbourne in Australia and ended up at Melbourne Law School, really in the late 80s, early 90s. And there were two things that really shaped my career. And when I think back on it, it's remarkable. The first was my first year lawyering professor, Ian Malkin, who was just an extraordinary teacher and someone who took an interest in his students, a real interest. And I think generations of law students at Melbourne who were fortunate to have Ian as their professor were deeply affected by him. He instilled a love of law and a love of learning about law. I knew nothing about law, and he showed an interest in me as a student, and that had a profound effect, actually. So I'll come back to that a little bit later. Within the LLB degree, I wasn't too sure about things. I took a year off and traveled around Australia and did all the normal things that Aussies tend to do. But in my later years in law school, I took Hilary Charlesworth's international law class. And
we're really big fans of Hilary Charlesworth on this podcast.
Yes, I perhaps don't need to say any more to this audience. And of course, sitting in public international law with Hilary as the professor, light bulbs went off. What is this thing of law beyond the state? Can one actually think outside of the nation state and understand the history and the relations of peoples and entities beyond state law? And of course, once I took that class with Hilary Charlesworth, I was really inspired. I realized with her herself, she'd studied at Harvard and had come back to Australia, started an academic career, really grounded in human rights theory primarily. I realized that was something I wanted to do and that it was possible actually to do it. And of course, there were many other professors at that time at Melbourne. I took Gary Simpson's Advanced International Law seminar, which was very challenging. And of course, Gary was very inspirational as well. But other professors such as Wayne Morgan at that time teaching human rights, and Penny Matthew as well. There was just a real firmament of tremendous international lawyers. And And this is one of the things I was going to say, that Australia really has this remarkable tradition of international lawyers. Maybe it's a desire to get out of Australia and see the world and travel, but there really is this incredible community of both academic and practitioner lawyers in the field. And that's been deeply inspirational to me and to generations of students, I think. Some of my contemporaries, Nihal Buddha, Simon Chesterman, Fleur Johns, many now international lawyers who've had similar pathways. And I think many of us inspired at the same time. So I was fortunate to get a couple of scholarships. One would have allowed me to go to the UK, one to the United States. It was actually the Lionel Murphy Scholarship. And I decided in the end that I wanted to go to the US, again, inspired by the path that Hillary had taken, but also because I was deeply interested in human rights as a field. And it seemed to me that the United States was really the place that one needed to be to engage both with the academic work, but also a lot of what was happening. This was the mid-1990s. It was the kind of unipolar moment, the end of history and all of that. And I thought, why not go to New York? I think New York was probably the greatest attraction. But also, of course, at that time, Lou Henkin, Shruti will remember this, Professor Lou Henkin, Oscar Schachter, there were a number of tremendous international lawyers at Columbia at that time. And the opportunity to study and work with them was what really drew me there. So I went to do the LLM at Columbia. And again, somewhat on a whim, but partly because of my background in South Africa, there was this small seminar being taught by a professor I'd never heard of by the name of Jack Greenberg on the constitutional law of South Africa. Now, for those listening who may not know, Jack Greenberg was this remarkable civil rights lawyer. He unfortunately passed away in 2016, but he was legal director of the NAACP. He famously was one of the counsel in Brown versus the Board, and had this remarkable career in civil rights law in the United States. And he had a real interest in post-apartheid South Africa. And of course, South Africa was emerging at this time from the long dark years of apartheid. And the 1996 Constitution was coming into effect, the new Bill of Rights. And Greenberg brought to Columbia many of the anti-apartheid lawyers, the judges, many of whom were ultimately seated on the new constitutional court that was created in South Africa. And one of those lawyers was a man by the name of Arthur Chaskelson, who had actually been one of Mandela's lawyers in the Rivonia trial in South Africa, and ultimately appointed by Mandela as the president of the Constitutional Court. And I got to meet Chaskelson and some of the other judges, and so decided that I would see if I could get a clerkship coming out of my LLM at the Constitutional Court. I wrote to some of the judges, Albie Sachs and Johan Krichler and a couple of others, and ultimately was fortunate. Chaskelson himself hired me as what was then known as a foreign law clerk. And again, this was just one of the supreme acts of fortune in my career, because it was 1999. It was sort of the high watermark of the Constitutional Court in South Africa, these remarkable jurists who'd been appointed and had a chance to shape the new jurisprudence in South Africa under this new Bill of Rights. And Section 39, for those who are familiar with the South African Constitution, instructs the judges to have reference to international law and also permits the court to have reference to foreign law. So almost the diametric opposite of the United States, where there's deep resistance to citation to foreign and comparative law, the South African Constitutional Court actually requires it. And it has this incredible library and these incredible clerks from all around the world. And really, this was international law heaven for someone interested in human rights and comparative law. And of course, working for, he then became the Chief Justice of South Africa, Arthur Chaskelson, was one of the great privileges, actually, of my life to to have that opportunity. So again, I could never have predicted that, but in a sense, it was going full circle back to South Africa, where I'd grown up as a child. I worked with a fellow law clerk, Lwandile Sisolana, a Black South African lawyer, one of the leading advocates today in South Africa. And again, having the chance to work closely with a Black South African was impossible for me as a child growing up in South Africa. And so again, that was a very special experience. So yes, I perhaps I'll leave it there. I returned from South Africa back to New York and to Columbia, and was fortunate to get a position directing the human rights program at the School of International Public Affairs at Columbia. And it was again Lou Henkin, who by that stage was getting quite senior, shall we say, older in his career. He taught a huge class at the School of International Relations in international law to non-lawyers. And he decided he could no longer really carry that teaching load. So he asked me if I would teach his course. And I was absolutely shocked. I was a young lawyer at that stage, but I had the opportunity to teach international law to 100 or so international relations students from literally all over the world who'd come to New York to study and do a Master's of International Relations at Columbia. And again, that really, I think, was an experience that made me convinced that this is what I wanted to do, to teach human rights and international law, and to do serious research in this area. There's another whole interesting story here. I'm not sure how much I should go on, but like many scholars in the United States, I went onto the teaching market. The academic market in the United States is literally a market. You go to a hotel in Washington and you interview. And I had an interview at a place called the University of Maryland. And my first question was, where is Maryland? So that's where I got my initial teaching position. And it's really where I have been ever since, the last 16 or 17 years, directing the international program at Maryland, and where I worked so closely with Shruti. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Thank you so much, both of you. That was I found that fascinating, the different paths you both took. And Peter, as you said earlier, we were all in Cape Town in December last year, and it really struck me there how much international law is done in South Africa. It's as you say, international lawyer's paradise in a way, the incorporation with domestic law. But one thing that struck me as both of you talked about your careers is how much reflection I'm actually seeing from the paths you took and the issues that became important to you to the work that we do as a team today. Now, as we said at the beginning of the podcast, our research is on populism and international law. Sitting here in Australia, there is a debate about how much populism is in our mainstream politics. It's certainly there to a degree, and a debate about how much it's affected us internationally. But for you two, it's much more close to home. How has it been for you living and working in international law during the first Trump administration, during the Biden years, and now potentially looking down the barrel of possibly another term of President Trump?
Well, it's definitely been a wild ride, to say the least. And I was thinking about some of the things you were both saying today. And I guess one of the ironies of my life is that my pursuit of international law has led me to places like the University of Maryland, Indiana University, and now the University of Missouri. And I loved Peter's comment about Maryland because I think my first time that I had ever been to Bloomington in Indiana was when I went to my interview for a job at the International Affairs School in Indiana. And likewise, my first visit to Columbia, Missouri was for my interview here. And I think so that's one irony, right? That the more I've advanced in the field of international law, the more I've been in the center of the heartland Midwest of the United States, which is, again, not places that I would have imagined pursuing international law as a career when I started out in law school in New York or my law firm or clerkship in San Francisco. And I think another irony has been how helpful it has been to think about my experiences in international law and how they apply to just what our situation is in the United States. And I think how I would characterize it is working on the Women's Convention as an American lawyer has been always a really interesting dynamic, because that is obviously a convention that the United States has not signed and has refused to join. But has been, the drafting of the convention and a lot of the interpretations and things have been really heavily influenced by US lawyers, and particularly lawyers working on advancing human rights and women's rights in the United States and globally. So one of the dynamics that creates is that a lot of the human rights standards in the Women's Convention and other human rights documents come out very differently in the United States than what Peter described as the South African perspective and the view of how the law works, which is to say that very little of what is in the conventions can be mandated in the United States, right? It can be, people can join something or aspirationally view something as a voluntary goal. When you're thinking about, for example, I've written about gender diversity in the judiciary in the United States. In other countries, you can have mandated, resources, rules, supports, try and, think of various ways that the state can help support women enter the judiciary. In the United States, those efforts are mostly voluntary, right? They're done by groups like the American Bar Association, or there's different associations of women's bar networks and associations that try to advance, advance equality and parity in the judiciary, as well as lots of other things. So what that means, I think, is I saw a lot of that happen firsthand during the first Trump administration and through the Biden years, which is to say that I think that a lot of people were really taken by surprise by the sudden and abrupt rollback of rights. And I've said many times that it's really painful for me to think that my daughter, who's now 7, is born into a world where she has fewer rights than I did when I was growing up in the United States. And what I saw was that a lot of people were shaken into action in 2016, 2017. And I read this really interesting paper by Theda Skocpol where she talks about the changes that women who were new to activism, or at least new to seizing what power they had in local and state environments, was that she said something, I'm going to paraphrase it poorly, but it was something about change will come first in the places where the institutions are the weakest. And I saw that play out, right? So on the one hand, it's where institutions were weakest, as in state parties and other areas where populists or people without experience could seize power quickly, right? At the same time, where institutions were weakest were where women could really make inroads and rise to leadership positions and things like that. And I've seen that all over the Midwest and all over the United States, where you have people who organized or came out for the Women's March or something like that, and had done protests in the past, but not, or, maybe been attuned to certain issues, but not really gone out there and done the grassroots work of organizing and advocacy that actually creates change at the local level that then feeds up to the state level and then to the national level. And that's been a really exciting thing to see. I can look around and see the people that I moved to Indiana in the beginning of 2017. I can look around and see I met lots of people because they were just joining different groups and women's organizations and thinking about how are we going to, have educational resources for our children? How are we going to fight against the rollback of women's rights and human rights that we're seeing? How are we going to protect immigrants' rights? Things like that. And I've seen all of those people who sort of started out saying, I'm really upset about the situation and I want to do something. And now those people are out there doing things. They are at pretty high levels at advocacy organizations. They have on the ground experience as to how to mobilize and experience. They and organize. A number of my friends ran for office, or including myself, and were in these positions where they had the chance to make a difference. And again, I see that where the institutions were the weakest and are the weakest. They've been the easiest to take over, and it's just a question of, who's trying to take them over and why, and who is trying to get engaged and energized and activated, and what are they trying to do. And so now, if you look at Indiana and Missouri, there's a lot of grassroots level work. You'll see Missouri has a couple of state referendums that are on human rights issues, for example, reproductive rights. And I don't think you would have seen that 10 years ago in as a widespread manner as you see now. And you wouldn't have seen networks of moms and women's groups and things like that who were as sophisticated and who have now built the networks that they have. So I think that, I've seen lots of transformation. And to me, the question now, as some of those changes have sort of matured, and the Biden administration, I think, was marked by, from my perspective, the desire to want to create change and create this better world coming out of the pandemic, but hamstrung by lack of capacity and resources. And so we have sort of this vision, but not as much of an ability to make things happen. And so the question, I think, for the next administration is what's going to happen with all of that energy and organizing and activity that's going on at local levels that I think is quite different from what we saw leading up to 2016 and 2017. And, as we speak right now, we don't know how November is going to turn out, and things could go in any direction. But I think we'll see more institution building now by the people who first came into those institutions over the past 8 years or so. So I think that'll be interesting to see how that comes out.
That's really fascinating, Shruti. And I'm going to turn to you, Peter, in just a minute, but it just occurred to me as you're speaking, we did some field work on the project earlier this year, myself and Jeremy Farrell and our postdoctoral scholar, Nina Araneta Alana, in the Philippines, looking at populism in the Philippines. And the idea of institutional strength came across really strongly there too. We call it institutional resilience. And it does, I think, make a big difference in terms of the effects of populism, how strong and resilient an institution is to withstand that. Peter, how's your experience been in America in the last 8 to 10 years?
Yeah, it feels like we can't escape Trump, right? Particularly when Trump was on Twitter, it felt like every waking minute was the latest outrage hitting our screens. And to some extent, as an academic, I think all of us on this project have tried to make sense of this moment, right? The rise of Trumpist politics. I mean, speaking just about the United States for the moment. And our latest article, actually, which will be coming out shortly on populism and international law, is really an attempt to actually theorize what actually the heck is going on in the United States and globally around this rise of populism. And so, it's been interesting to try to think it through conceptually and academically without getting too emotionally invested in the politics of the moment, rather trying to understand the events that are occurring around us, rather than necessarily seeking to take sides or to condemn or to take a particular normative position. And what's interesting in the literature is that some scholarship, really interesting scholarship, is starting to emerge now. I'm thinking particularly of Mark Tushnet and Bojan Bugaric's latest book on populism and constitutionalism. They have this ethos as well. How can we understand populism, the rise of populism at this moment? And I think this kind of work is really needed, to step back from the kind of craziness of Trump and all his antics, and to actually try to theorize a bit about this moment. And of course, I would say two things about this. One of them, at least in the United States, is that populism is not a new phenomenon. There have been all sorts of populist moments and movements in the US. For many, Bernie Sanders is a populist on the left, right? And if you actually look at the politics around populism, it can take many forms, and it can pick up on many forces within societies. And so again, it's interesting to think of populism as a mode or form of politics internal to the history of constitutional democracy, and that's what we try to do in our piece. There is a tendency amongst academics, particularly, to see the rise of populism and people like Trump as a kind of external pathology or threat that somehow threatens the values we hold dear, the liberal structures of the rule of law and of democratic norms, and so on. And, famously, Hillary Clinton referred to the deplorables, right? And referred to the miners of West Virginia who could be re-educated once the mines were closed down. This kind of approach to populism, I think, is disastrous because it actually fails to take seriously what's actually occurring. And because Trump is such a clown, there's a sense that he's not actually tapping into these deeper forces, political forces that are operating in the United States. So if we flip the script a little bit and look at two things in the Trump moment, one of them, in his inaugural address as president in the first administration, hopefully that'll be the only administration, he refers to the factories littered across the American West as kind of tombstones, right? And the devastating economic effects on large parts of America by neoliberal economics and the policies of really the post-Cold War economic order. And that is real. That is real. You go into the middle of the United States and you see that people have suffered under these policies, that in many cases, the opioid epidemic, the poverty in many parts of the country has actually accelerated, and that Trump is actually tapping into a deep unease that there is felt globally, I think, with the neoliberal economic order, and that is being felt in many parts of the United States. Of course, the financial crisis of 2008, which was global, accelerated this concern. And so, one of the interesting things that Trump has done, we forget that he first destroyed the Republican establishment before he destroyed the Democratic establishment. So he's kind of exploded the consensus at the center, if you like, of the so-called elites, and raised this question of a more populist economic politics. And I think there's some hope in that. There's some possibility for a different kind of politics. And the real struggle, I think, for the Democrats is to seize that moment and to actually develop an economic agenda that is populist in its orientation. And in fact, the Biden Build Back Better strategy is highly effective because it, in fact, is actually picking up, right? I mean, the kind of Scranton Joe image is actually very effective. It explains, I think, why Biden was able to defeat Trump in the last election. And of course, one of my concerns with Kamala Harris is whether she's going to be able to articulate that kind of economic agenda that she's going to need to beat Trump. But the other side of the coin, and this, of course, has been a deep concern for international lawyers for a great deal of time, has been the imperial foreign policy of the United States, particularly the use of force. And I think 9/11, was a turning point in the United States. I think both Shruti and I were in New York at that time. I certainly remember the day distinctly, September 11, 2001. And really, many things changed in US policy that day. But of course, you can draw a straight line, I think, to the invasion of Iraq, previously the invasion of Afghanistan, and really catastrophic decisions that were made to use force on a sort of neoconservative foreign policy that was a clear violation of international law and all the basic norms of collective security that the United States had itself supported in the post-Second World War period. And again, Trump, much as we may dislike him, has tapped into this deep unease with foreign wars, imperial wars. And one of his most popular lines in his speeches is to say, no more foreign wars. Now, of course, I'm not sure whether, if he were ever elected again, whether that would actually be true. I suspect not, actually. But the point is, that this dual axis of neoliberalism and neoconservatism is challenged by populist parties and politics, and I actually think that's a good thing.
I love the thread of hope that comes through both of your answers. Something about transformation, and even from ashes, you both see possibilities for a better future, which is fantastic. But one thing I just wanted to pull out is, we talk about the US, and, Shruti, you mentioned the way that the US tends to be highly influential in creating treaties, but then doesn't sign up to them. And Peter, you talked about the US's use of force. Do you think there's anything uniquely American? And, we talk about American exceptionalism, all those ideas, but is there anything uniquely American about the way that various administrations have either engaged with or disengaged with international law?
Yeah, so I mean, this is a wonderful question. We'd need another hour together to
Yeah.
really unpack it. But, in my field, which I've thought about most deeply, of course, human rights, the paradox is most obvious, right? The United States regards itself as the exceptional nation, the nation committed to human rights, and yet refuses to either ratify at least half of the International Bill of Rights, famously, many of the signature treaties in the field. And even in the case of those treaties the US has ratified, like the ICCPR, it does so subject to both reservations and declarations that it has no domestic effect at all, that it's non-self-executing. So Lou Henkin famously explained this to me. He said, in the United States, human rights are for export only. So Shruti mentioned the sort of imperial histories of human rights. That the work of people like Tony Anghie and other Twale scholars have really, I think, for many years revealed this paradox in U.S. foreign policy and helped us to understand it more clearly. I think it's a fascinating question, because I think, again, at its core, it rests on ideas of popular sovereignty that are key to the American political project. And the idea of submitting to the authority or the jurisdiction of international institutions or international instruments is deeply antithetical to this sort of history of popular sovereignty as the foundation of the American political project. So in that sense, this is nothing new, right? That the idea of the United States as just like any other state, subject to the international rule of law, has never really been a reality as a matter of fact, right? Let's not forget John Bolton saying that if, what was it, 5 floors of the United Nations building were removed in New York, nobody would notice. That was long before Trump, and even before the George W. Bush administration. So I think this is one of the great challenges in international law, is trying to understand this resistance in the US and trying to work with it or work around it, or trying to think of ways to manage it once we start thinking about things like international human rights treaty regimes.
That was really interesting. And I want to build on some of the things that Peter was talking about, and some of the things we've been looking at in our work, which is that, I think it sounds like the constant we're pointing to is the bifurcation or dichotomy or hypocrisy or whatever we want to call it of, the US sort of stating various ideals, and then, as Peter was saying, either backing away from treaties or doing something different domestically. And I think, we've been talking about how that, those differences are in a lot of ways aimed at appeasing or amplifying domestic constituencies, right? And how that works. And in that sense, what looks like flip-flopping, I think, from the outside internally makes sense, right? Because you can see, who, like, which groups and sort of what impulses, various administrations are trying to satisfy through their international policy. And I guess one of the I'll maybe talk about a case study that I think is particularly, maybe case study is not the right word, but something that I think is really interesting, because I'd been talking about the CEDAW convention before, which is that I think I've seen really interesting things happen in that space because the United States hasn't signed on to it, right? Because the United States hasn't signed on to it as a state party, it can't operate in an official capacity in a lot of the meetings or the places where a lot of the policy debates happen, right? And so again, it's the flip side of what I was talking about before, whereas I said when people are trying to enhance gender standards in the United States, they have to do it on a voluntary basis or through non-state actors and non-state networks. You sort of see the flip side of that in the CEDAW space, where the US is not acting necessarily as a state actor. You have lots of people coming in from NGOs and human rights organizations or lawyers from different areas coming in to work in that space, but not under this official kind of capacity or anything like that. And so I think that for me, I've seen a lot more of an impact from the global South, like countries from the global South and people and both state and non-state actors from the global South have been able to kind of fill that space left by the absence of the United States, and not just fill it, but really expand it and take a more vocal and more of a leadership role. And so then you see the opposite of what I was saying before happen, where when you see ideas and standards and legal interpretations come to the United States through the Women's Convention, it's not through state actors. Again, it's through non-state actors. And to me, the best example of that is the reproductive justice movement in the United States, which is built off of a global reproductive justice movement and came to the United States through the work of Black women who were working on these issues in the United States, went to Cairo and Beijing and Nairobi and some of the places where these ideas were being talked about, fused what the work that they were doing in the United States with some of the ideas and strategies that they had seen in these spaces, and then brought them back to the United States, and then again are putting them into law from the bottom up, right? It's not the US federal government that's mandating these different things. It's that people are working at local levels to change the laws locally, or to change how things that impact women's rights or the education system, or all of these things are being shaped. And I think that's a really interesting story, and I think points to the richness of the space that is there, where you don't have as much of, you still have hegemonic powers and things like that, but to a lesser extent, I think, than in other UN contexts or other global governance contexts. And you also see a lot of populism in these spaces, because we see a lot of ties between populism and ideas of hierarchy, traditional families, gender roles, all these things that are being talked about in the UN CEDAW space. And a lot of the right-wing populism that we've seen all over the world and in the United States as well, you'll see some of those ideas tested out in that UN CEDAW space, right, where people are talking about gender and change and transformation of traditional roles and things like that. And so in many ways, you have a microcosm of the things that you see all over the world. And you see where the messages were shaped and formed and how they're being transmitted around the world, and usually through informal networks as opposed to, again, state actors in particular. So I think that's a fascinating side story, or to me, a very interesting primary story, but something that is often overlooked.
That's absolutely fascinating, Shruti. And, as both of you said, I feel like we could just keep talking on these issues for about 6 more episodes of the podcast. But we do, we do have to keep it to a reasonable limit for our listeners. So I might ask you each perhaps one more question, and then we'll wrap up, though I'd love to keep going. So Shruti, my question for you is, drawing on a lot of the things about gender that you've been talking about already, and coming back to the pandemic, you've written about the pandemic, about the COVID-19 pandemic's gendered fault lines and their impact on international law. As we move on from the pandemic, obviously we still have COVID around, but that pandemic moment, as we move on for that, are you continuing to see gendered impacts on the development of international law, or in the way that international law is impacting global governance or the international legal order?
Yes, definitely. And again, I think this is something that isn't often the focus of global governance or international law. So I think it's really interesting to think about. And, as we come up to 2025, we are coming up to Beijing plus 30, right? That's what the next CSW, Commission on the Status of Women meeting in the spring of 2025 is going to be focused on. And what we saw during the pandemic was that, many of the most immediate effects accumulated along the lines of disparities that already existed, right? Where there was unevenness or where there was the least support, those were the communities impacted the most. The fewest resources were impacted the most. And people talked a lot about care work and how, the people that we depend on to do the care work that was impacted by the economy, whether you're talking about health or education or, family support, were the ones most taken for granted and paid the least and had the least rights and resources, and how we all as a society had to really look at that and think of that. And the question was, how are we going to come out of that, right? And I think that is still the question. And I would reframe it in some of the ways I talked about earlier, where I think the pandemic really showed us what institutions were the weakest and where the weakest safety nets were, and where states had lost capacity to act, right, and lost the capacity to take actions in ways that could support, whether you're talking about the economy, the school system, whatever it is. And I think the danger is that you don't want to be trapped into these cycles of helplessness, right? Because the more that people look to, anyone in power to try and alleviate what's happening, and the less that they can do, then you just can easily get into this spiral of there's nothing you can do and things are just going to get worse. But I think, now that we've seen a lot of the major economies of the world adjust back to maybe some kind of new normal, like where we have higher prices and more inflation, but people are getting jobs back. I do see these conversations happening about how are we going to build a more resilient society, more resilient institutions, and does that mean how does that mean that you disperse power? What does that mean about who you include and what you focus on? And so again, I think these are the challenges as we move forward, and this fits in really well with the call to think about future global challenges, or not even future, but current global challenges like climate change, right? Again, how are you going to come up with ways of collective action that aren't getting us trapped in these negative spirals, but are moving in a positive direction and building more capacity for collaboration and cooperation and resilience. So I think it'll be really interesting to see what happens. And can I make my book recommendation to follow that up? Okay. So Imogen had mentioned that if we had any books or other things to recommend for people. So the book I'm going to recommend is was written by one of my former colleagues at Indiana University, Jessica Calarco, and she just wrote this book called Holding It Together: How Women Became America's Safety Net. And it's a fascinating look with a lot of vignettes, stories from people talking about their experiences during the pandemic and before. And I think you'll see the personal side of everything we've been talking about today. Like, why are people drawn to populism? Why are people rejecting it? What are people experiencing in the wake of all of these changes in a very, very personal way? And she adds some interpretation about what she thinks it means and what people are paying attention to and what they're saying. So that's my recommendation going forward.
Oh, I'd love to read that.
Yeah, me too. Thank you, Shruti. Okay, so Peter, I do have a question just for you as well, and it draws on You've been talking about your work in the human rights space, but a lot of your work has focused on law and religion in that space, and especially religious freedom as a human right in international law. I was wondering how you got interested in that issue, and can you tell us a bit more about your work in the area?
Yeah, well, it's really, thank you. It's a fascinating question, actually, and the short answer is it was a complete accident. Um, like all great things in life, I actually began my doctoral work at Columbia on comparative free speech, if you can believe it. For the Aussies listening, I was interested in the freedom of political communication, the kind of work that Adrienne Stone has done so beautifully, and began writing on that. But I had a position as a researcher at the Center for the Study of Human Rights at Columbia, which is a kind of university-wide center. And they had funding for a project on religion, religious freedom, and human rights, which brought activists and lawyers from Eastern Europe and the former Soviet states to Columbia for a kind of training program. This was really the sort of post-Cold War moment. And so I started developing and teaching a course. It was an amazing course, actually, co-taught with many Columbia professors and religion scholars. But it was kind of a sleepy field. Law and religion was a kind of a sleepy field in those days, and there wasn't much happening. It was of academic interest, but it didn't seem that promising for an academic inquiry, really. And then, as I mentioned, dramatically, 9/11 happened. And suddenly the question of religion, and in particular Islam, on a global stage was the only question that people were talking about. And the idea of the sort of resurgence of religion and religious forces, the histories of international law and how they related to religion, suddenly became not just questions of interest, but questions of enormous importance to the world and what was happening around us. Of course, there was enormous discrimination in the United States. Again, Shruti will remember this as well. Muslim scholars, facing all sorts of discrimination at that time. It was a very dark time, I think. But suddenly the work that I'd been doing in this field became, I think, more relevant. And it's really guided my work ever since to try to sort of think through the intellectual histories of international law again, and to get a bearing on where we are exactly on the relation of religion to the modern state and to the idea of modern rights, and particularly individual rights to things like religious freedom. And it became, to me, just one of the most fascinating projects I've been engaged in. I've written quite a few pieces at a theoretical level on these questions, and was very fortunate to get involved in an earlier project. The title was the Politics of Religious Freedom, and it had 4 scholars, one anthropologist from Berkeley, Saba Mahmood, a law and religion scholar, Winifred Sullivan, and a political scientist, Beth Hurd at Northwestern, and myself. And the 4 of us really, again, did some interesting work trying to think about how the idea of rights was being shaped and shaping the politics in this area, and also how the politics of rights was being shaped in various ways. And so it's been, again, a very fruitful area of work and research, and continues for me, both theoretically, but also in very practical terms as well, looking at decisions, for example, of the European Court of Human Rights dealing with Muslim minorities in Europe, and looking at, if you look at recent public law around the world, the issue of anti-discrimination law in its relation to the claims of religious groups and individuals, cases like the Masterpiece Cake Shop decision in the United States, or the Hosanna Tabor decision about discrimination against a teacher. These kinds of conflicts are becoming more pressing and more evident. And so I'm trying to think through again what's actually happening to make these conflicts seemingly more intractable, and how we might address some of that.
Really, really fascinating. So I think we might bring the podcast to a close at this point. I want to thank Peter Danchin and Shruti Rana very much for coming on Called to the Bar. And we do have a couple of questions that we usually ask our guests as they leave. One is book recommendations, and Shruti's already given hers. But Peter, if you have any further reading that you'd suggest to people interested in any of the myriad of topics that we've sort of touched on today, that would be great. The other question that I'm going to ask you both is one, a lot of the things that we deal with as international lawyers are not light topics. We've talked today about conflict. We've talked today about discrimination. We talk about things that can be really quite distressing, and it's things that we deal with every day in terms of our work. And so my question is, how do you switch off? If you switch off, how do you do it? What do you do that takes you away from international law all the time? What are you watching, reading? What's your escape route to get you away from international law?
Yes, maybe I'll just answer very quickly because I realize we are out of time. The two articles that I've read recently that I just thought were amazing and would highly recommend. One is Anthony Angi's piece in, I think it's in the European Journal of International Law, on the history of the Twale movement.
That's a fantastic piece. Yeah,
it's a terrific piece. We look at it quite closely in our Populism article. Shruti and I worked on that, but I think Angi really is amazing, and that article is a great tour, if you like, of what's happened in the intellectual history of Twale and where it's going. So it's a beautiful piece. The other, my old friend and colleague Nihal Bhuta, now at University of Edinburgh, has a recent piece on social rights. And again, I think everything Nihal writes is deeply theorized and brilliant. And I think this is a terrific piece as well. In terms of escape, for me, it's very simple. I escaped to nature. Many years ago, I took up ultra distance running and hiking. And what I love to do is get out of my office, get away from the computer, and disappear into the woods for as long as possible.
Those are great recommendations. And I second all of those articles. And then I'm going to give you all much more lowbrow things, I guess. I like to totally escape also. And so I love reading romance novels or watching romantic comedies because they always need to turn out with like some kind of happy end and some kind of happily ever after. So I feel like I could go through whatever emotional roller coaster there is, but like it'll all be okay at the end. And then similarly, actually, I love watching like terrible movies, especially the apocalyptic or post-apocalyptic ones, because I think somehow seeing all these things play out convinces me that it can't happen in real life. And so one of the like best / terrible ones I've seen recently is Geostorm, which has everything you could imagine. There's global governance, there's the US government doing incredibly bizarre things, and then there's the environment being completely insane, and then there's dramatic special effects that make no sense, and then a twist, a very interesting twist 2/3 of the way through. And there's even a speech about the UN and global governance, which I think is really funny. So, and then, you can't help but burst out laughing at the ridiculous scenes from the movie. So that's my guilty escape, I guess.
That's brilliant. I think maybe at some point in the podcast, we're going to have an episode on international law and the movies. Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Peter and Shruti. It's been wonderful having you on Call to the Bar. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you.